Jerome, thank you very much. And can I also extend a very warm welcome from the Housing LIN to all of you who've been able to join us this afternoon. This is actually our last happy hour of our current spring and summer series. And I'm sure we'll be back with a whole full programme in the autumn. But we've had a great sort of start to the year and really delighted that we could end this programme with this happy hour session, looking specifically at fostering design for an ageing population. We draw on a couple of things that have really come through the LIN over the last 6 months or so. One is around how to think much more around inclusive design and looking at better quality design, and that couples with the recent government announcement of their National Design Code. It also thinks about how we think more about intergenerational living, and we're being joined by Steve Connor today, Development and New Business Manager at Phoenix Community Housing, and Irene Craig, a long-term friend of the LIN, Director at Levitt Bernstein Architects. And they'll be talking about their work at Melfield Gardens, about the initiative they've got in place there. And we're also super delighted to have Julia Glenn with us, Design Innovation Lead at the Healthy Ageing Challenge at the UKRI and Innovate UK. Some of you may be aware that I sit on the National Advisory Board for the Healthy Ageing Challenge, and there's some really exciting work going forward there. And we're looking forward to hearing about an upcoming competition that Julia is going to be leading on, and how we may align ourselves with that. So we've got a lot of things going on here. We're going to kick off by looking more at intergenerational housing. For those of you who are not aware, the LIN does host a dedicated webpage on intergenerational living, and I'm sure we'll put that up in the chat box in due course. But what's really nice is to think both from Steve and from Irene what's actually happening in developing this in practice. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, hopefully you can all see that.
Yep, that's perfect.
Yep, thank you very much. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steve Connor from Phoenix Community Housing. I'm going to begin by just giving you a little bit of information or background on Phoenix before telling you how we came to our architect's brief, and then I'll introduce Irene, who's going to tell you all about the scheme, and I'll come back and tell you a little bit about the intergenerational housing initiative and how that's going. So, Phoenix Community Housing, I think, a very unusual housing association. We were formed back in 2007 after a mass stock transfer from Lewisham Council. We now own and manage 6,300 homes in the very southern part. We're in 3 wards in the very southern part of Lewisham. I say we're unusual because we're resident-led. We operate under a governance system known as the Gateway Model. We're the only housing association in London to do that, and only one of 4 in the UK that operate that model. The Gateway Model itself, it aims to encourage and support residents to take an active role in the day-to-day runnings of the housing association. So we have residents involved at all levels of our organisation. They help us steer policy and make decisions. And I think this is really well. It's a really good example of that is our board, which is 50% residents, both tenants and leaseholders, and both the chair and vice chair of our board are Phoenix tenants. This slide actually is they're all Phoenix tenants, and it actually contains something, at least 9, but perhaps even more, former and current board members, including the current and former chair and vice chair of our board. Sometimes we sort of play a little game as to try and spot the board member, but we won't bother with that today because we haven't really got time for that. But our development activity, so we started in 2007. Our development activity actually started in 2010 when we decided to build our own headquarters in the heart of our area with a community hub. We moved into that in 2013. By that stage, we decided that we were going to start to develop new homes, and our first residential home, we worked with Levitt Bernstein and Irene, and we built a 60 1- and 2-bedroom extra care scheme called Hazelhurst Court. That's just shown in this red circle in the left-hand corner of the screen. 60 1- and 2-bedroom flats in 2 blocks, and the idea is really that we have people with care needs, with low, medium and high care needs. We have on-site 24/7 care for those residents, and I think it's a great place to live. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. The Melfield Gardens scheme, before we move on here, you can see that, you can probably just see that this was an early view of it, but you can see that we've sort of landscaped the area that surrounds it and integrates it with the existing Hazelhurst Court, which is an over 55 scheme. And there's private housing on this side. And we've done our best really to try and integrate all of this development together. And you know, I think as you'll see later on, it's worked really, really well. Melfield Gardens, our new scheme, is in the blue circle up here. Currently the site comprises of 16 bed sits and a tarmacked area that was former garages that have been taken down, is just now providing parking. You can see there's about 200 metres between the two, so there is a relationship there. And between the private housing, private flats here, we have a terrace of family housing. About 2/3 of it is privately owned, and there's a tower block at the end of the road which is owned and managed by Phoenix. That's 7 stories. And on this side of the road we have 2-storey terraced houses, I think all of them privately owned, which back onto Melfield Gardens. Just some images of Hazelhurst Court. First of all, the flats they're really lovely. They're dual aspect, really light and airy. They benefit obviously from natural ventilation and daylight, which I think has really been a really big plus. The development itself, I think in comparison to a lot of extra care schemes, doesn't have a huge amount of facilities, but it does have a really lovely dining room and lounge area. You can just see the dining area here and the kitchen just adjacent, and that goes on to the lounge area. You can see the courtyard, enclosed courtyard at the back here. That's this area here. And then the garden, which is from this side, is a lovely landscape garden. And I think the whole scheme is, I had the opportunity to help out in lockdown when the residents were isolated. I was helping give out the meals actually there, and I really appreciated, although I worked on this scheme on the development, I didn't really appreciate it until I was there what a nice scheme it was to actually live and work in. I think it's much improved. These photographs were taken in autumn 2017 after the development was completed. And I think the landscaping, since it's matured, you can see planters on the walkways. Many of these are now in use, and all of the planting in the courtyard has developed. And we had a really nice area to work with outside anyway. So it's a really lovely scheme. And the Melfield Garden scheme, I think, really draws on this in a number of ways, which I'll explain. So going on to our brief, we know we spend a lot of time talking to our residents and learning about our residents, and we know from the information we've collected and statistics about the area that we live in a disproportionately old part of Lewisham, so if that makes sense. So and that by 2025 something like 35% of our residents will be over the age of 65. And 9% of those could be over the age of 75. So there is certainly there is a demand and an increasing need for good quality accommodation for people in older life. So from that, and from the experience of Hazelhurst Court, we did want to build more older persons accommodation. And also the fact that there was such close proximity there and a relationship that we may utilise going forward. But we didn't want to build another extra care scheme because we didn't feel we had enough space at Melfield to build a sufficient number of units and to provide the facilities that would need to go alongside that. One of the great things about Hazelhurst Court was that we managed to move 20 of our own residents into Hazelhurst Court that were under occupying family-sized houses, and that created a situation where we could move people off the housing list that were in overcrowded accommodation into that family-sized housing from 1 beds to 2 beds, from 2 beds into the family size housing. So it created a bit of a chain reaction, which was great. And we wanted to learn from that. So there was a focus on trying to make these new homes at Melfield Gardens as attractive as possible to people who might want to downsize within that age group. That led us on to this idea of a 1-bedroom plus home, which Irene will talk about more in her presentation. Also, I mentioned about the landscaping around the existing homes and the new homes, and that was something that we felt we really think that all of our developments, that's an important thing, because we recognise that the existing residents really, you know, they don't benefit necessarily from the new homes, and it's important to do as much as we can in the surrounding area to make them feel that they're really gaining from this and not just having to look forward to a couple of years of development activity. So a lot of thought and emphasis goes into that. We wanted the development to be environmentally considerate. We're very lucky that both the chair of our board and our chief executive are very much environmentally minded and keen to do as much as they can to tackle climate change. So we decided to this and all of our developments, if we can, to make them Passivhaus. So what I believe is the highest energy efficiency standard in the UK at the moment. We wanted to meet that standard if possible. And then finally, there was this question mark about intergenerational housing. I mentioned that, you know, this site is located in what you would call a diverse community. And I think we all certainly get the idea of, you know, residents living alongside, older residents living alongside residents of different ages, developing relationships and getting support from that, and you know, hopefully living you know, longer and independent lives as a result, and not suffering from loneliness and isolation. But does it actually happen in reality? And what we wondered was whether or not we could do something within this scheme to encourage that sort of interaction, that social interaction. Okay, so this was kind of our brief. It was wider than this, but I'm going to hand over to Irene now, who's going to tell you about the architectural response.
Thanks, Steve. Hopefully it's smooth transition. There we go. So just to follow on from what Steve was saying, I think I probably don't need to dwell on this too long because it's saying roughly the same sort of things. But I suppose one other thing just to mention about this site as well is the fact that there's an existing footpath and right-of-way that runs from where Hazelhurst Court sits down here and the train station, Beckenham train station here, that runs along the houses and actually goes up through the site and up to Southend Lane at the top here. And so one of the other parts of about the contextual side of the brief was that actually we needed to retain that. That's a really important route for people to use and catch buses and things like that. So that was one of the other sort of key drivers that we had to think about when looking at the site. The other thing to mention is there is a railway that runs all the way down here. If you can see my cursor, I hope everyone can. Yeah, so obviously we need to think about the noise issues there as well. So moving on, there's another aerial photo of the site in a little bit more detail, and that you can see the footpath that runs up to the existing block. One other thing that's really important with this kind of site, which obviously we have to deal with at Hazelhurst Court as well, was the existing residents who would be remaining here during the build, during the disruption that brings, and thinking about, you know, what are they going to gain from it? Because that's when you have, we did a lot of consultation, which is obviously the way that we like to work, and that community, and that Phoenix work, and so it's also about what can the new scheme bring to them to make their environment better as well. So that was another important part of the brief. So I'm just going to run through a few sort of key issues that come out of Steve's brief that he highlighted earlier. And obviously one of the key issues was about a community of different ages and an intentional community, which is a bit more difficult to do. Everybody lives on a street or in a block, probably at the moment, that is an unintentional community of people of different ages. But how do you create that from scratch and try and make it work? in a kind of natural way. And I suppose this is a very early diagram that that kind of has stuck through all the way to where we are at the moment, which is post-planning application, which was about creating a kind of focus to the site by creating 2 blocks on either side of that route that I talked about, which kind of creates a conversation between the 2 blocks, and hopefully conversations between residents as well. And by kind of angling them a little bit as well, and I'll come on to Passivhaus in a minute, that also creates a sort of focus, physical focus to the space in between. And so we also have landscape architects, and so the spaces between the buildings also become really important to creating the opportunities for people to meet and to spend time together potentially, or even just to have incidental conversations. The other thing that we thought about were the kind of, I suppose we call them sort of doormats, or into and out of the site, and how we might deal with the existing block at the end by creating a better environment for them, for their entrance, their bins, all of those really practical things. And I suppose Hazelhurst Court, again, going back to that lovely scheme, is also creating, it's about these are the opportunities that I mentioned. Obviously, this is a fairly large event that happened quite close to the opening, where a local samba band came along. But it doesn't have to be this kind of big event, but it's about creating these spaces that can be used, and people can have conversations and meet their neighbours and have these interactions. Diving into the detail, Steve talked about making these homes attractive for people to move out of their existing, probably houses. A lot of the people that moved into Hazelhurst Court were in probably 3-bedroom family houses. They might have grown, you know, their families might have grown up there with them. They've become probably a little bit unmanageable, big gardens, that sort of thing. Those are the kind of reasons why people start to think about moving out when they get a little bit older. And so what we were trying to do here was try and think about ways that we could make the homes more flexible, a little bit of extra space without going necessarily to a 2-bedroom flat, which brings with it the sort of extra rent, potentially bedroom tax as well. So coming up with a kind of hybrid that we've been developing over a number of years. We are using on a couple of other schemes as well, which we call a 1-bed plus, which creates, if you look at the left-hand plan here, we've got a fairly standard flat plan with the front door, entrance hall, a shared kitchen, living, dining. But then we create this space in between the main bedroom and the living room. We create a sort of small room there, which could be used either as a study, a hobby room. It could be space for a carer or a grandchild or another relation to come and stay. It's not big enough for a kind of formal bedroom, and it doesn't get counted as a bedroom under planning, but it's potentially a very flexible space, and we've allowed for a pocket door there, a sliding door, so that can also be opened up into the living room. So if somebody just wants to have a sort of area and more spacious feeling flat, they can do that. And so we're thinking that is going to be something that's going to help make this more attractive for people who are downsizing. The other important thing here is, again, learning from Hazelhurst Court, is dual aspect flats and how important it is to have windows on both sides of the flat, and that's partly to do with the environmental and the passive house, but just being able to have that window at both sides of the flat just makes such a huge difference, I think, to people's well-being, to the amount of daylight in the flat. Also being able to see people coming and going on the walkways and seeing your neighbours and seeing across to the other block. We also, part of the brief was also to go for a really ultra low energy approach. So we're going with Passivhaus, and I don't know how many people know about that. I'll go through that a little bit towards the end of the presentation, just the principles of how we achieve that. And that has informed the design of the block as well. But building further on Hazelhurst Court, I've mentioned the dual aspect homes already, and the sort of the importance of those landscape spaces and how important and how successful they are at Hazelhurst to bringing people together out of their flats when they want to socialise. I think the important thing is in these kind of schemes is if people want to be private, they can be private, but if they want to socialise, there's lots of opportunities to do that. And then the other issue is the access to the flats. Steve showed this photo already. And these window boxes are now being used a lot more as well, I think. But the outdoor access, which I know I've seen from the Q&A already, somebody's questioning that. whether it's a good idea to have it outdoors or indoors, but it's been a real success at Hazelhurst Court. And one thing that it does, and you can't quite see it here, but because it's a kind of horseshoe, people can see each other coming and going in and out of their front doors. They can see down to the ground floor, up to the, you know, you get a real sense of the community, and we wanted to kind of replicate that with the new scheme as well. Steve's already mentioned the consultation. So despite COVID, we did a bit before COVID in person, but we also had some online events. We also managed to put it onto VR as well. So we had a really interesting session with some of the board members with the full headset and stuff, which was really interesting. They didn't get too seasick, I think. Going back to just the concept, I won't dwell on this too long, but this was the very, very first sketch. I think we did probably even for the competition, Steve, and a couple of street level views just to show the existing environment, which is quite hard. It's a little bit unloved, and we're really wanting to improve on those kind of approaches and landscaping. And so that then translated into this kind of ground floor layout, where you can see that we took that very early diagram of the kind of the cupped blocks to try and create a kind of focus in the centre. We also had to think about Passivhaus and orientation, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail, but which bits face south. We want to try and get as much south facing orientation for the blocks as possible to get the most energy we can from the sun. And this site runs north-south, so we end up with a lot of east and west, which we had to grapple with quite a lot, and we had to do quite a lot of manipulation of the forms. And these are two diagrams to show the kind of the levels of sun penetration we're getting on different faces. So that was quite a key design generator as well. But I think what's important here is looking at the spaces, how carefully we're trying to integrate landscape with vehicle access. We're having to take refuse vehicles still through here to pick up bins from the existing block, but we're trying to do that in a way that makes it a really pedestrian focused area. Also thinking about the spaces around the block. And one important thing to mention is, as well as the flats here, the 1-bedroom plus flats that we have for the older residents, we also have one communal space, which I'll show in a little bit more detail, which sits at this end of the block, which has its own sort of shared little garden at the back. So that's a kind of garden room that people can come and meet, make a cup of tea while they're maybe sitting in the garden. And we have the two flats that are specially designed for postgraduate students. So Steve's going to talk more about the relationship with Goldsmiths College in London, but that's how the brief crystallised in terms of the intergenerational aspect. Was generally it was to be flexible 1-bed flats for older people, but with some accommodation for mature sort of postgraduate students as well. So this is a drawing that shows how the whole thing has kind of come to life as a building, and so we've, as I said, we've kept the kind of the cranked forms of those buildings. We have gallery access decks along the inside of those faces, so they're facing each other. So as people are coming and going from their flats, they can sort of see what's going on. They can see down into this area. The public can walk through here as well. So it's quite an active place. They're not just tucked away and forgotten. And I think in terms of trying to combat isolation, that's a really important part of the scheme as well. The garden room that I talked about sort of sits down at the bottom here with its own communal, more private garden space at the back there as well. And we also re-landscape the parking for the houses that sit along Melfield Gardens here. So as well as providing some parking for the scheme. So again, that's about giving back to the existing residents who are sort of sitting around the scheme. This is a little bit more of a sort of zoom in on the landscape, and what we're trying to do here was, as I say, integrate the necessary sort of service and disabled parking that would need to come through the scheme, but also to make it as a really pedestrian friendly environment, potential for group gardening, and lots of interest to look down on from the spaces above. And also thinking about routes across, so that if you just want to go and see your neighbour who's living across in the other block, there's lots of different sort of ways of doing that through the landscape. It's all quite visible. We've got two sort of main entrances on each side, which have a special treatment architecturally, and views through from the front door right through to the back. So you just get this sense of airiness as well. Bikes and buggy stores, I won't go to all the practicalities, but we have buggy stores, we have bin stores, and we have to think quite carefully about where those went again for passive house reasons, because they're colder spaces. So just to briefly go through the plans, this is the ground floor plan, there's the garden room at the bottom. And these are all that we have wheelchair flats actually at ground floor. So we do have 10% dedicated wheelchair, fully accessible flats, which are slightly different to the 1-bed pluses, which we always call a CAT 2.5 for those of you who know the standards, which is a little bit between a sort of standard flat and a full wheelchair. It gives you the access that's required. The bathroom's a bit bigger than a standard flat, but not the absolute full wheelchair. It means if you need to be in a wheelchair for a while, you can still get in there and move around properly in your wheelchair. That's an upper floor. On the second floor, so this is where we have one of the student flats, which sits at this end of this block. So they're integrated on the, they're not just set to one side, completely all stuck on one floor together. We have one on the second floor on this side, and then as we go up to the top floor, that's the other 4-bedroom flat there. So there will be a total of 8 students in the scheme altogether. That's the intention at the moment. And there's a zoom in on that shared living flat. So they'll be sharing. It's a bit like a fairly standard student accommodation shared flat. And Steve can talk about the ways that they're going to interact with the residents. Just a couple of little details about, this is one of the sort of entrances where we've given quite a lot of thought to special decorative brickwork within what has to be quite a simple building because of the passive house requirements for quite a simple form and envelope to the building. So we've worked hard to try and give interest where it's important and put the money where it matters. And this is a shot of one of the decks. So this is one of the ways that people get into their flats, so front doors open onto here, and we hope that we have little sort of push outs occasionally as well, where people can just pause and have a chat if they want to with their neighbours. Just briefly on passive house, hopefully I'm doing okay for time. Why passive house? Passive house is a really ultra low energy method for achieving sort of being on the road to zero carbon. It's a really practical approach. It's been around for quite a lot of years. It's well tested. It started off in Germany and sort of Northern European countries, but it's really starting to gain traction in the UK. It's basically about making the envelope and of your building, the walls, the roofs, the floors, as airtight and as highly insulated as possible. So basically you're using as little fuel as possible, which means that obviously the residents will have low fuel bills. This is an all affordable scheme, so that's a really important thing, especially for older people. The amount of, the ratio of their income that's spent on bills is higher probably than the average for those people on low income. So that's really important, and they spend more time in their homes, especially in the winter. So again, fuel bills are really important. If it's, the kit should be easy to use, and that's something that we always focus with, and we're going to work really carefully with Phoenix to make sure that the controls are easy to use, but it's not difficult. And it also actually helps with the quality of build, because there are such stringent standards that we're having to meet. It actually means that the build has to be really good, and so there is better quality control, and there are less defects generally and snagging on passive house. It's also, this is a lovely little diagram we did with as part of the publication about how to get to zero carbon, and just saying that we're running out of time. And so clients like Phoenix who are addressing this now are doing absolutely the right thing, and I think everybody is going to be doing something similar to this in the near future. And just some other schemes. So it is becoming a bit more normal than it used to be. We did actually Loudon Road, top right here, back in about 2010. It was a really pioneering project for a housing association in London. But Goldsmiths Street in Norfolk, which won the Sterling Prize recently, is another sort of typical example. And it doesn't have to be expensive either. So I won't go too much into the technicalities, but this sort of illustrates what I was saying about lots of insulation, air tightness, You can open the windows, but I think there's a myth that you can't open windows. If you're in a passive house, you can. In the summer, you do. In the winter, you might not, because you will lose heat. But it's really important to, it's triple glazing, it's very high levels of insulation. It's about getting the orientation right for your building first of all as well, and making sure that the shape of the building is simple, so you don't have lots of ins and outs that all have to be insulated with lots of difficult junctions. So don't do this. Do something a bit more like that. I think it's a challenge then to make the architecture interesting, but I think that's a good challenge that we all need to look at. This is about windows and insulation. It's about making lots of use of the sun, so making sure the buildings aren't too close together so that you can get the winter sun to help heat up your home as well. And again, I showed this earlier, but this is part of the modelling that we did with a company called Etude, who specialise in passive house design, to really make sure we're making the most of the south and west gains on sun, making sure we've got the right size windows and the right elevations. Looking at balconies. The other thing, obviously, that I hope people are aware of is how overheating is becoming a problem, particularly with new housing, with climate change, with warmer environments. So it's also making sure that while we're making windows larger, that they're not too big, that we shade them as well, whether with balconies or actually with shutters, as we have on some of the windows on the west facade at Melfield Gardens. So that's something else that we've spent a lot of time kind of honing and modelling as we've gone along. And these are just some of this is the south elevation, so we have larger windows here and some shading over the top of those. And this is the west facade where we have, sorry, it's rather difficult to read, but we do have balconies shading the bigger windows, and we have some shutters on some of the bedrooms as well. And then just to finish off some of the CGIs that we have done. So this is looking from the railway bridge, looking with the existing block sitting here. And you can see some of the shading that we have on the west facade here. This is looking from Melfield Gardens, coming up from Hazelhurst, looking through to that space in the centre. And as you can see, I mean, a relatively simple kind of architecture, but using the brickwork and patterns of brickwork and recesses and things like that to give interest. And this is looking the other way, looking down through the sort of landscape space in the middle, and the galleries where people will enter their flats and hopefully see each other and start to have those conversations that we talked about. So, hand over to you, Steve, hand back to you.
Thank you very much. Oh. Can you see that okay? Yeah, great.
Yeah, we can see that fine. Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, so continuing on. So our intergenerational, the housing initiative, it really sort of kicked off in 2019 when our chief executive, really good at networking and what have you, set up a meeting with the warden and the registrar of Goldsmiths University, and we presented our initial ideas for the Melfield Gardens scheme and the idea of involving postgraduate students in the scheme as a way of trying to bring about this interaction between residents and students and try and reduce isolation, etc. So they really were keen on what we were trying to do. The outcome of that meeting was that they identified people from Goldsmiths for us to work with, which turned out to be the head of student accommodation and the well, now he was the director of finance, but is now a consultant who works for them. So we've been working with them since then. We held a workshop in January 2020 where we brought together people from all across Phoenix. We brought together some of our residents from the board. We brought together people from Goldsmiths and students. We watched videos about intergenerational housing. So we got a better understanding of what intergenerational housing meant. What sorts of intergenerational housing were around and what the aims were. And we also sort of just broke into small groups and discussed what intergenerational housing at Melfield Gardens might look like. I think the outcome of this particular meeting was that we produced the terms of reference. So we had an outline vision for the scheme. the names and individuals who are going to be working on the scheme moving forward, and how we would work together. Then, unfortunately, the wheels fell off and the pandemic hit, and we couldn't really come together. So obviously we were all working from home, and for many of us we could work remotely using this sort of medium. But unfortunately, we decided that we were going to work with a number of our residents who lived at Hazelhurst Court, and with some of the students from Goldsmiths particularly. And because we felt it was more tricky to kind of get everyone to use technology, we wanted to bring the residents together at our headquarters, the Green Man. And we didn't get an opportunity to really do that until December, when there was this small window where we could bring people indoors in small groups. So it had to wait. But it was a really good meeting. So you can see the images there. We sort of two different meeting rooms, and a number of people remotely from the different organisations. It was attended by, as I say, residents from Goldsmiths, students from Goldsmiths, both current students and postgraduates who are currently working at Goldsmiths, which was a really nice, gave a good mix, and some of our older residents from Hazelhurst Court. We gave a presentation of sort of architectural presentation, really, to sort of give them an overview of what the scheme would look like, and then we sort of presented this vision of the postgraduate students being offered sub-market accommodation, or sorry, yes, sub-marketly priced accommodation, very high quality accommodation, I should say, and in return being asked to volunteer some of their time each week, where they would spend that time making contact with the new residents and getting to know them, and sort of trying to perhaps either organise or take part in social activities. We then asked a number of sort of, asked both the students and the residents sort of a series of open questions: what they thought of the idea, did they think it had merit, what did the residents feel about being contacted by students, what sort of things the residents might need or like support with, or activities that they'd like to engage in. Similarly, how the students felt about being asked to engage with the residents, and what sort of constraints did they feel existed, and where they had any concerns. I mean, in terms of they both, I think, really liked the sound of the idea and the offer. The list of activities were basically endless, which was good. One that tickled me was around the residents suggesting that they would teach the students how to cook, which, you know, I'm not sure if that is kind of right or not, but it was certainly one thing. But there were a number of things that considerations. So from a resident perspective, they didn't feel that you could force these relationships. It was certain people would like to be contacted in certain ways. So some people they might like the idea of being called or being knocked on. Some people might prefer a text message, or and not to allocate one student to a certain individual, but more have a sort of a mixture of more organic, I guess. Not to be overly prescriptive with the types of activities that were arranged, so to leave that to the students and the residents to kind of try and figure out what they both wanted and whether they were working or not when they started doing these things. Another thing that was important for the residents was how long the students might stay there for. So they didn't want to see a very sort of quick change or quick turnover in students. The longer the better. Similarly, from a student's point of view, they were slightly concerned about how much time that they would have to allocate each week, and there was concerns, particularly for postgraduates, around perhaps working part-time and studying and what time they'd have available. They didn't want to set unrealistic expectations, so they didn't want to be sort of spending all their time putting together flat pack IKEA furniture, for example, or just being seen as a spare pair of hands. At the same time, they would be happy to say take a dog out for a walk if someone was feeling unwell or something like that. So there was just a you know, about understanding what was expected of them there, really. And then what sort of support that they could get from Phoenix and Goldsmiths. They could be potentially faced with a vulnerable resident and not being sure how to deal with that, or perhaps even somebody passes away while they're there, which again is something where they may not have experienced and might find difficult. So what sort of support they could get from both parties. So that kind of brings us up to where we've got to, really. The next steps for us are to bring the same group of residents and perhaps a larger group of students together. I've been fortunate to meet some students recently that have been actually working, living in accommodation and with older residents, and it'd be interesting to hear how that relationship has worked out. We're going to present a revised vision now, responding to some of the comments and questions that were raised at that previous workshop. And also we're going to begin to discuss the idea of how we might evaluate the benefits of this initiative and discuss that. While all of this has been going on, we've been trying to get the property management agreement together, and we've had solicitors helping us work through a wide range of sort of property related issues, so tenure, length of agreement, rent, service charges and bills, the specification for the property, what fixtures, what fittings, what appliances are being provided and by who, the repairs and maintenance, what sort of, and what happens if the students or the residents have problems with each other, and who do they go to for assistance, this sort of thing. The next phase then will be to, having completed workshop 3, hopefully we'll be able to produce what we're calling a good neighbour agreement, or perhaps the community promise, which sets out a shared agreement, or shared vision rather. And it's something that we will have agreed upon, the residents, the students, Goldsmiths and the Phoenix officer will have agreed upon what the expectations of those who's living there, particularly students, is. And then we will then determine how we will monitor the initiative and assess it as we go forward. I think I'm just about out of time, but just to sort of say that, so this is just a timetable now for the scheme. We obtained planning consent obviously in March 21. We're hoping to appoint a main contractor by the end of this year, at which time the agreements between the parties will need to be signed. Hopefully start construction work early next year and practical completion in the autumn of 2023. Thanks very much.
Steve, that was great. Well, both of you, that was great. And I know that we've got dozens of questions both in the Q&A box and in the chat room as well, and we will come back to that. But as I think Sally posted in the chat box, this is also going to be an upcoming case study where we can answer some of those questions as well. But we look forward to touching on some of those after we've heard from Julia. Julia, I apologise, we're slightly overrunning, but please don't let that hinder you at all. Really pleased that you and colleagues at Innovate UK, UKRI can join us, and we're really looking forward to hearing about the Design for Ageing competition that you are due to announce formally later this year.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I will share my screen and hopefully, again, a smooth transition. So I'm hoping that everyone can see that.
Yeah, that's great.
Brilliant. Okay. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Steve and Irene. Really interesting presentations there. Really enjoyed those. So I'm going to tell you briefly about our upcoming Designed for Ageing competition, which is opening in September 2021. So you've got a bit of time to kind of think about how you might shape your application if you're interested in applying. So in terms of the Healthy Ageing Challenge, in case some of you aren't familiar with this pillar in terms of the Industrial Challenge Strategy Fund, the Healthy Ageing Challenge basically has 7 main areas of interest in terms of investment. And those are looking all about the areas of continuum from living as we do now into older age and beyond. And so those areas include living well with cognitive impairment, sustaining physical activity, and increasingly connectedness. And all of our competitions fit somewhere within those 7 themes. So I will now talk a bit more about the competition itself. So Design for Ageing is basically an opportunity to receive up to £2 million in grant funding to advance your business. So very generous award sizes, and we're looking to fund projects which last up to 2 years. So we're looking for discrete projects that take an innovation from here into the market that lasts 2 years or less. And the competition, as well as receiving money, is a very interesting opportunity. Of course, I would say that, but it is true, a very good opportunity to leverage our unique competitions design stage gate. And I'll tell you a bit more about that, but the stage gate basically will encourage you to look at your design credentials and make sure that you leverage those as assets so that longer term you can capture more market share and make your organisation more sustainable. And it was really interesting listening to some of the things that Steve and Irene were saying, because they fit very well into some of the co-creation themes in terms of the design stage gate. So this is the competition profile. We're launching in September. We have well over £14 million available, and this pot is growing, which is interesting. So 2-year project, as I said a bit earlier, and we're looking to fund projects between April and May next year. Awards between £500,000 and £2 million. And the reason this is business-led is because we're looking for industrial stage research in terms of applied research based on iterating within a market environment. But we do welcome collaborations in terms of academic partner with industry partner and all sorts of other collaborations, which I'll talk a bit more about as I go through. So the opportunities in terms of funding are correlated to organisation size. So small organisations, 70%, large organisations, 50% of eligible project costs. And interestingly, we've had approaches from organisations that span all of those sizes. So I think it's going to be a very interesting competition. So profile-wise, this is what we are looking to invest in. We're looking for service-led innovation, really interested in innovation that enables self-care for independent living. Very interested, as I said earlier, in that idea of ageing as a continuum, rather than drawing a boundary and looking at who's on which side of that boundary. So continuum innovation is something that we're really interested in. Sustaining physical activity for obvious reasons, positive health externalities, happier people, and that includes active travel. We're also looking to invest in service-led innovation that improves what we term common complaints of ageing. Those include mental health, which I think is a really interesting opportunity because it broadens the kind of applications that we're seeing that are approaching us. So very good examples in terms of Steve and Irene's intergenerational living, that idea that you can take the best parts of different age cohorts and use them for positive mental health experiences. So, oh, sorry, I've skipped on a bit there. So in terms of applicant profile, business-led, but you can have partners, collaborative partners, and very happy to address those on a case-by-case basis. Another thing that we're considering doing is via our Centre for Ageing Better community of practice platform, running a session where we can bring innovators together to see whether there's collaborative opportunities, because a lot of what comes across my desk is people who have, say, A to N of the innovation journey, but are looking for N to Z in terms of being able to capture full market share and making their service have the maximum utility. We also are looking for solutions that address inequalities in healthy aging. So that may well be in terms of business model, in terms of how you might broker that service. So who's going to consume it and how, whether that's brokered via, say, a local authority, so that it's about everybody being able to consume it rather than those who can afford it. So that's a big area that we're interested in. And then linked again to the stage of research, which is industrial stage research, we're looking for services that are already defined. And by that, we mean that we want our applications to already have shape, to already be iterating with a customer or customers, albeit on a small level, so that we can apply the design stage gate to get the best yield and to help kind of accelerate you towards optimum market share. So this isn't a competition for ideas, it's further along than that. So this is a competition life cycle. So the application window is September through to November, and very happy to talk to people who might be thinking about applying, to have a discussion about whether you're in scope, etc. And then we're looking to hand out awards to successful applicants April, May 22. And then we're applying our design stage gate, which I will go through in a bit more detail after this slide, in October, November 2022. And the idea is that you'll be able to demonstrate people-centered design and co-creation mechanisms, so you will sail through this and your funding will continue. So this is what we call the design stage gate amplifier. So the idea is, which I think I alluded to before, is that by having a very people-centered design approach, you evolve with your market and towards your market and towards the appetite of your market. So you end up with that all-important bigger market share as a byproduct, or as a absolute cause and effect of doing that. And I thought Steve's example of having his members on the board of Phoenix Housing was a really, really good example of that, because I can imagine that you went in a direction that perhaps you never would have thought of going in if you hadn't had that feedback and hadn't been exposed to the needs of the customer. So I thought that was a really interesting example of that. So we will look in the design stage gate, we're going to look at your user engagement, we're going to look at your people-centered design. So we'll be looking at your feedback mechanisms in terms of how you gather feedback from your customers and your users, and how you apply that so that it becomes an asset in terms of moving towards your market. And then we'll be looking at your community group, your user group, and seeing how they've consumed the service, what their opinions are, whether they've discovered any blind spots, whether it's very, very close to being something that could be scalable, or whether there's kind of a bit more work to be done in terms of listening to the customer or the user. And then we ask that by the design interactions from gates 1 to 3, that you revisit what you thought might have been your feasible market share, and update your business and commercialization plans, so we have a fair view of how that design journey and how that people-centeredness has taken you kind of along that continuum to market. So really excited and seen some really, really good examples of really good design rigor. So we think this will work well. So basically, the design stage gate is to help as you iterate and evolve your service, to help you keep user engagement and human-centered design rigor front and central, with the absolute idea that alongside the grant funding, you can use co-creation mechanisms as an asset to give your organisation the best chance of success. So that is the opportunity. And as I say, Jerome has this slide pack, and really delighted to link up with anyone who's interested in applying. And I will feed back via Jerome and Jeremy this idea of a kind of matchmaking forum if people are interested in collaborative entry. So thank you again for having me, and I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Julia, thanks very much. That was really informative, and we look forward to partnering with you in a number of ways and taking this forward, especially as you near that approach of the September date. I think what you've described around co-creation, co-design fits in very neatly with what both Steve and Irene talked about in terms of engaging both the residents and prospective customers as well as their students. So it links in very neatly with sort of the overall theme of this afternoon's happy hour. So thanks ever so for joining us. I'm conscious that we've got about 10-15 minutes left. We have never had over 20 questions in our happy hour. You've certainly generated a lot of excitement, team, all our presenters for this afternoon session. And I've been sort of busily trying to think about, which ones to focus on. And I'm going to start with those that have given the most thumbs up, so that people who have wanted these questions asked. So Julia, I'm conscious that most of these at the moment are very much focused on Melfield Gardens and questions for Steve and Irene, but I will come back to you in due course. So the first is from Tony. How do you get away with so few parking places in the scheme?
Well, you answer that, Irene.
Well, I think we're quite lucky because we're in London and there's a lot of pressure from the mayor and from local authorities to try and reduce car use. So I did actually see this question come up, so I did a little quick journeying up from our planning application. We've actually, we've got 4 wheelchair spaces, wheelchair accessible spaces, mobility spaces for the wheelchair flats that we have in the scheme. So those are new to the scheme, but we also had to make sure we re-provided parking for the existing block that sits at the tower, that little tower that sits at the end, and for some of the houses further down. So we've got 4 spaces for the wheelchair accessible flats, and the rest, Steve, from my memory, are actually re-providing what is there already. So it's effectively what we would normally call a sort of zero parking scheme, in that we only need to provide the parking for those people with mobility issues. But that's really, I know that having, we work in other parts of the country and even in different boroughs in London, and Hazelhurst, we had a much bigger problem with parking there. That was a few years ago. The planning policy was a little bit different in those days, and we had to actually provide a lot of parking for that, didn't we, Steve?
We did, and we actually ended up having to introduce parking management, because that's those aren't adopted, well, they're not adopted roads. So we could introduce a parking management scheme there that does limit, one that you might have noticed in an earlier slide, that the station's there. And when we were first developing Hazelhurst Court, it was clear that there was a problem with people commuting and parking there in the mornings and spending all day there. Once we introduced the parking management, those spaces were freed up, and that meant that there really wasn't as much pressure on parking. So we had the benefit of knowing how much parking was available after Hazelhurst Court was built, and there was quite a bit of free capacity around there. So, so yeah, we don't have to provide too much in a new development because there is some existing. So. But
it is, we know it's an issue. I mean, we've just completed a scheme in Preston where we needed to provide a lot more parking. That was partly coming from the clients who knew that their young, more active residents would want to keep their car. So it's always a difficult balance. But for us, it's making sure that if we do need to put the parking there, that we keep it in a place that isn't dominating the environment. You're not walking into a car park to get to the front door. So it's about managing where it goes on the site as well. That's really important.
Okay, well, thanks for that. The next question is from Ian, who's again a long-term friend of the LIN and done some great work in central beds. He's asking about the extra care element, which I think is Hazelhurst. Do residents offer each other a measure of care and support, either in addition to or as an alternative to the on-site care team, reflective of the community-led nature of Phoenix? So again, looking about some of that reciprocity and mutuality in delivering care and support, perhaps, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is definitely yes. So I think one of the things that we've talked about here is about the postgraduate students, their involvement and the development of relationships between the students and the new residents. I think the more important point is that the students help the new residents meet each other and that they form the lasting relationships. And that's really what we would like to see come out of the students' introduction into the scheme. They will move on in time, but then the residents who remain there will have these relationships. So that's what we're really hoping to happen. And that's definitely what's happened as a result of the communal areas within Hazelhurst Court. So people coming together, one of the things about Hazelhurst Court is people have a meal in the afternoons together in the dining room area. And as I said, I went down there last year to actually deliver those meals up to the flats because they couldn't come to those communal areas. And that was something that I think the majority of able-bodied residents, some residents had their meals delivered to them every day, but the ones that could get down to the communal area really missed that interaction each day. And during the course of the year, as we slowly unlocked, more and more of those residents went and sat in the courtyard area because they could meet outside. And yeah, definitely, I think that there is definitely a lot of support that's provided by the provision of those communal areas, and that's what Irene and her team have done at Levitt Bernstein with the new scheme to help create those moments where people can meet informally. So they provide the moments and we provide the kind of people to do it, I suppose. That's it.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And what's interesting, both in the chat box and in the Q&A, is how some people have said there's a lot akin to the philosophy and approach of co-housing as well. So again, any thoughts about that, Irene?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting to see. I found that, you know, really heartening that people are comparing it, because I suppose co-housing is all about like-minded people, you know, coming together and creating something that really makes a community. And what we obviously, it's not quite the same in that we as designers and Steve as landlords are kind of bringing people together a little bit more artificially, I suppose. But what we're trying to do is create a framework within which a community can build and grow. Yeah. And giving the opportunities for that. And I'm always, you know, we did a scheme called Buccleuch House, which is also sort of multi-generational in a very different way. And because of the site there, we had to have an internal corridor and with flats on either side, which is a much more traditional way of doing extra care or older people's housing. We had to do it there because of the site issues. We brought light in and did all the things that, you know, you need to do to try and mitigate that, but people just don't see as much of each other. If you're in an internal corridor environment and you're just coming out your front door into a corridor, down the lift, and you just don't appreciate the people around you as much. You don't get as much opportunity to see your neighbours, and so that's why I feel that this way of designing it with these sort of more outside areas, being the circulation areas, has a real positive side to it, I think.
Oh, no, that's helpful. You may be interested to know that we actually featured Buccleuch House, or now called Lime Tree Court, in our happy hour last week, addressing the very thing about how to create communities that offer compassion, both to residents within their compassionate neighbourhood programme, both within schemes, but also into the wider community. And I'm sure we can post that onto the chat box, the link to last week's happy hour. Another question is from Dan Roberts. And he's asking again about the design of the buildings and the footprint of the blocks, and he thinks they're very interesting and quite unusual, but he's wondering whether there's any issues effectively around the 4-storey apartments overlooking any existing private rear gardens. So again, that sort of aspect issue. Either of you got any thoughts?
Well, I can tell you that this was an unusual scheme in planning terms. We only had 3 objections to the whole scheme. So I think that's an indicator of how people felt about the scheme. I think that we did publicise the scheme well. We kind of explained the merits of it, and it seems to have been very well received. And there is quite a long distance really between the homes to the rear where the 4-storey block is situated. So yeah, I mean, certainly, obviously, daylight sunlight studies confirm that there is no impact, but that doesn't mean to say people won't ask that question. But you know, we certainly didn't have any problems there.
I think we were lucky they have long gardens.
They do have very long gardens.
Doesn't mean that people won't object. I've done much longer gardens and they still object. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question because obviously we're not that far from the boundary, and that's when people start to get a bit twitchy sometimes. But no, I think the consultation that we did as well really helped, Steve, didn't it? The fact that we were reaching out right from very early stages to get input from neighbours, not just Phoenix's own residents, but the private houses adjacent. I think that helped.
we tend to sort of draw quite a big ring around the developments and invite a lot of people to come and talk to us and make ourselves as accessible as possible in terms of those conversations. And certainly in the case of Melfield Gardens, it resulted in almost no objections to the scheme, which was the council hold up as a model now of kind of consultation and getting through planning, I think. So.
Can I just interrupt here, because actually just down on the questions there's a one from Victoria, and she asked an interesting one which links into that sort of consultation and engagement aspect, which is about, would you think the design in virtual 3D would help residents to see what's going on, and for wheelchair users to see if the landscape works before you build it in relation to accessibility?
I don't think so.
Right.
The virtual reality world made me quite dizzy, to be honest, and it does take quite a bit of getting used to. You want to be sitting down, although the idea is to walk around when you've got the headset on. It takes quite a bit of getting used to. So I'm not sure whether it would be for everyone.
Irene, have you got experience of using that? I mean, obviously you've got the computer-generated images, but a virtual tour.
It's, I mean, I've used the VR before on a different scheme, which was quite tall and sort of going up through. It is quite vertiginous if you're not careful. So Steve's right. It does take a little bit of getting used to. So as a tool in a fairly traditional consultation setting where people don't necessarily have a lot of time, I think it wouldn't necessarily be the best thing. And sometimes maybe fly-throughs where you have a sort of set video or a series of stills together, that might give people a bit more of an accessible way of getting into it. But I don't think we shouldn't have perceptions about if it is older people using them. Some of them will love it. So I think it's always worth giving it a go and trying it out and seeing.
I had a cheesy grin on my face all the way through it, despite what I'm saying. So I would recommend everyone try it at least.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that's come through, and perhaps not in volume, but a number of questions related to this is around passive house design. And again, you talked a lot about that. So one is about future proofing, and another is about comparing it to sort of other construction costs, and also about things like installing electric vehicle charging points and the like. Any comments that you can come back to attendees on those points, either of you?
Well, actually, what part of Steve's brief, this was your thing, Steve, wasn't it? Was all electric. That was the other thing you were going to, it's going to be passive house, it's going to be all electric. It's going to be the first scheme in the country. It's going to be for older people, all electric and passive house. So it is all electric. And what else about passive? In terms of costs, we've actually done a study with Etude, the company, the practice I talked about, who are specialist passive designers. We have done a study with a number of London boroughs looking at the cost, called the cost of carbon, and sort of got costings through that. And it seems that the extra cost of passive house, because it is more expensive at the moment, is between 3 and 10% above normal. As a range above normal construction costs.
The thing is,
that could well go down. As the thing is that, sorry, I don't know if you're going to say this, Steve.
No, you carry on. Sorry.
People are, contractors are starting to understand it now as more and more of the schemes are delivered, and I think that will enable maybe the perception that it's very complicated to go away a little bit. and products will become more common as well as the market develops, I think. So inevitably, I think the costs will start to level out and become more equal, but there is a premium at the moment.
I think one of the things that we're working on at the moment is to look at building regulation compliant and passive house side by side. It's quite difficult because once you start going down the passive house road, passive house design is inherently efficient. So a lot of the embellishment you might get goes out the window. So you don't oversize windows. They're very, very carefully chosen in terms of their sizes. So you're not wasting money on large triple glazed windows necessarily where you don't need them, but you put them where you don't need them. You don't have overly articulated buildings anymore, like Irene showed in her presentation, which reduces cost. So whilst you are putting money in some areas, you're reducing it in what I think is waste. So actually the balance between the two, I think is, or the marginal difference between the two is quite small. And anyway, the regulations are taking us that way anyway. So it's only a matter of time before we're all going to have to be looking at this. If not the passive house standard, something approaching the passive house standard just by regulation. So it may seem you know, a bit futuristic at the moment, but it really isn't. And in London, you can't design anymore for gas. You can't use gas anymore. It's really, really difficult. And once you go down that road, you start to worry about how well the electric systems will work in practice and whether this will lead to fuel poverty because of the unit price of electricity being so much more expensive than gas. So the use of passive house really prevents that, because if you don't need space heating, which is really one of the outcomes of the passive house methodology, you hardly need any space heating, you straight away reduce a lot of your electricity demand or a lot of your electricity use, which means the costs are a lot lower. So, you know, you're future-proofing and you're kind of removing that concern. So, I mean, there's so many reasons why I think the use of the passive house methodology, even if you don't achieve the passive house standard, the use of the methodology has a huge number of benefits. For us, one of the big selling points was just quality. The robustness you need to do in terms of both the design and the construction phases is so much greater than if you were just building to building regulations. And the post-occupancy studies show, in terms of energy use, show a massive difference between those built to passive house and those built to building regulation standards. And that's purely because things aren't built to building regulation standard on site. They're just built and they're not really robustly, you know, looked at. And so that's the result. Sorry, Irene. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say the other aspect, which I think is really important for older people's housing, is that we did some post-occupancy evaluation on the Loudon Road scheme that I showed, the block of flats, which was just a standard block for mixed tenure block. But it showed that the temperatures and the environment internally was more stable. You know, when you compare it to the outside temperatures and to what you would expect, it was actually really stable and consistent. And so for older people particularly, there weren't those kind of peaks and troughs in terms of temperature and humidity. So it also, if it's done properly, will give that kind of consistency as well.
And that's another big point with passive house is overheating. I was going to say is another big consideration within passive house, which isn't really within building regulation compliance at the moment. So a lot of emphasis is put on the building not overheating. You're super insulating it, but you don't want it to overheat. So you really do analyse that as part of the passive house methodology. So hopefully what you're aiming to do is create something that's very, very comfortable and hopefully future-proof. So
look, I mean, I'm conscious we've focused a lot on this, and this issue about passive house, it's perhaps something we should come back to in September and do another happy hour on this. I'm also conscious that Julia's colleagues who are on the call, such as George and Cynthia, have invested funding through UKRI into quite a number of energy efficiency programs, work with Invisible Creations and others with London Rebuilding Society, both looking at energy efficiency, retrofitting existing housing as well as new housing. Perhaps there's a theme we can pick up with Julia and colleagues this autumn post the competition launch. But Julia, I want to come back to you finally, because Alex has asked you a question about some of the competition and about the common complaints of ageing. And he also sort of suggests, is there any way of looking at the competition around the focus around strength-based models of support or strength-based approaches? And I know in one of your slides you talked about self-care and looking at different models of care. So could you just come back to answer Alex's question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult in a presentation to kind of really put out there the scope, but absolutely, definitely services that support people to allow aging in place, services that help people stay independent for longer. And if you think about how those services could be put into the marketplace, obviously there's a lot of synergies in terms of extra care and the housing market, because they could be services that support people within a care environment or within their own home. So yeah, absolutely, self-care services, self-management, seen a lot of really interesting technology around management of pain, improving various declines in terms of eyesight and hearing, and all really, really interesting applications. And it's just that point about the use of technology so that it's consumable in terms of into old age. But yeah, absolutely, and happy to have a chat with, what was it, Alex, he said, who put that question out there. So yeah, absolutely. I hope I've answered the question.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And again, it's a real shame we haven't had a chance to go through all the questions, but I know Jane and others have been putting links up, and Sally and Jerome as well, to relevant resources. And we will be sending the recording of this happy hour along with the slides, as well as the questions and everything asked out with this, hopefully tomorrow or the day after, by all means by the end of this week, to coincide with our weekly bulletin links. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw it to an end. We're nearly 5 minutes over. Can I thank all of our three guest presenters? A big cheers, and I look forward to buying you a drink when we get a chance to meet in person. And happy for a real happy hour. This, as I said earlier, is our last happy hours of this series. We very much look forward to resuming in September. We hope to put a bit of the spotlight again onto the competition and work with Julie on the team to really promote and feature this, to get HousingLIN members and partners fully engaged, and hopefully to put some really fantastic world-class submissions in as well. Can I thank the team behind the scenes, Jerome and Sally, for all your support in making this run so smoothly, and for everybody who's attended, thanks very much for your real both penetrating questions. I'm really sorry we haven't had a chance to get through them all, and thanks also for the positive comments in the chat box. So that's goodbye from me and goodbye from the team.
Thank you.
Bye everybody. Thanks again.